Right. Good evening and welcome to today's webinar. My name's Micheline Mungai and I am from Futurelect in the Alumni and Special Projects Directorate. But most importantly, I'm an alumni from the 2020 cohort and work very closely with this community on the alumni committee. And so today's webinar is the first of its kind, and it's hosted by the Governance Working Group from the Futurelect community. And the intention of this webinar is to broaden efforts to deepen our understanding and build experience in governance. For those of you who are new to Futurelect, because I believe we have on the call with us this evening alumni who make up over 125 alumni from across the Southern African region from our public leadership program. And we also have alumni who are from our inaugural Women in Public Leadership program, who have journeyed throughout, who've graduated, from the Futurelect leadership programs. So to all the callers who aren't familiar with Futurelect's work is part of Futurelect's vision and mission is to equip young people and women who want to make a substantive contribution in the public sector and ensuring that it is ethical. And not just ethical, but as Linda always says, that politics is fun. There is fun in integrity. And so this webinar forms part of those efforts. Today's session will be moderated by Lesego. Lesego is a distinguished Futurelect alumni from our 2020 cohort. Lesego holds a master's in development policy from KDI School of Public Policy and Management in South Korea, and brings a wealth of experience from her work across the public and private sector and nonprofit sector. She's deeply committed to driving impactful change and improving outcomes within communities. We are thrilled to have her guide us through this very important conversation on governance and public sector. We hope this discussion fosters new connections and inspires collaboration and strengthens our collective impact in sharing ethical and transparent leadership in Africa. Without further ado, I'll hand over to Lesego, who will take the time to explain more about what the webinar is about and introduce our fellow panelists. Thank you.
Thank you, Mish. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to our webinar this evening. We appreciate all of you for joining us and being with us and making the time to join us. We are especially humbled and honored because as a working group, this is the very first conversation we're having on governance. And I'm excited by the conversation that we'll be having with our panelists this evening. So maybe just to give you a little bit of context on what inspired this conversation that we're going to have is when we consider good public governance within the democracies that we exist in, particularly in Southern Africa, there are many issues that we're grappling with: climate change, poverty, inequality. But when we consider the visions of those in the political space, to realize those visions, to bring those ideas into reality and actually execute on them, that is on the brunt of the public service. So I appreciate our panelists for taking on the clarion call and doing this work. But we want to hear from their experiences. What does it mean to be a public servant? But on top of that, how does that incorporate under the banner of good governance within the spaces that we're in? So this will hopefully be the first of many conversations that we'll continue to have on governance. And we thank you all for supporting us as the alumni program of Futurelect. So before I hand over to my panelists who will introduce themselves, just a few ground rules. We will be having a Q&A section towards the end. However, you can use the chat function in the meantime to put in your questions if you have any, or some comments that you might have, and we will get to them later. Secondly, when we do get to the Q&A section, please use the raise hand function within Zoom so that we can be able to see that you raise your hand and you want to share a comment or a question. But please do, as passionate as we all are, I can sense it, that we're all passionate about governance. Let's keep our questions and comments to, under at least 2 minutes when we do have that opportunity to share our thoughts. We also want to thank those who've already sent in their questions prior to this webinar. We will get to those as well during the course of this discussion. So we do appreciate all of you who took the time to send us those questions prior to us having this conversation. And then lastly, the views and opinions expressed on the shows are not those of Futurelect or the organizations that these panelists are a part of. So please do separate their views from the organizations that they're representing. Without further ado, I would like to immediately go into it and allow our panelists to introduce themselves. And I'll immediately start with Bheki and say, please tell us a little bit about yourself. There's something within the alumni community that we're all familiar with, is the story of me. What is the story of Bheki and what led you to joining the public service? Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Lesego. And good evening to everyone who's on the webinar. As Lesego mentioned, my name is Bheki Mkhatshwa. I come from a small town previously called Witbank, now known as Emalasheni. I'm a chartered accountant by background and started my career within investment banking, but I'm currently under the employ of our government in the now no longer existent Department of Public Enterprises. And yeah, I think maybe not to take too long in the story, but to explain kind of why service. I think the world within banking and kind of where I came from and all the people that I had around me and staying within that sphere was almost a set kind of way for us all to go. But it didn't kind of address, what about the rest of kind of the world? Because if you think of it in size, the world that we lived in was quite kind of small. And in reading newspapers and just keeping up to date with current affairs, there kept on being this question and frustration, with what was happening in government or not happening. And then I kind of asked myself the question of, well, what am I doing about it? It's very easy to complain. It's very easy to say that, they are not working, but who are they? Why are they not working? And yeah, because of that, I decided to make the jump and to try it out while I'm still young, not necessarily wait later on and see what it's like on the other side of the fence. And that's actually what led me to Futurelect, funny enough, en route to being where I've been working the last little while. And yeah, I think as we go into the conversation, I'll probably dive more into some of those experiences, but looking forward to the chat.
Great. Thank you so much, Bheki. Over to you, Ruth.
Evening, everybody. My name is Ruth Capon. I'm part of the Futurelect Alumni of 2022, and it's really great to see some of you on the call. I am from Cape Town. I grew up here, and I currently work as a senior professional officer in the city of Cape Town in the policy and strategy space. My previous work was in the province in a similar space, so I hopefully bring two different spheres of government perspectives to tonight's conversation. In terms of the story of me, it's always so challenging, and so much of Futurelect is about trying to refine that story, but to try and tell it in a short, succinct way. So I think I've always felt that I wanted to be part of something bigger than myself and a strong sense of justice. And I felt that government was one of the most effective ways to do that. And so really wanted to kind of maximize my impact for change by being part of that. My family background, I have a history of family history of public service, but mostly in the medical sphere. So it's taken me some time to figure out where best I fit in making a contribution. Yeah, and then I think also I was excited to dig beneath some of the negative perceptions that we have of government and see what it's really like. My previous work experience was in academia, which tends to be very critical of government, as well as NGOs, which, depending on where you are often also critical. So I think it's been both inspiring, but also challenging to have to be on the side of the doing rather than the critiquing. So yeah, happy to be here. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Ruth. Kagiso?
Good evening, everybody. I'm Kagiso Zwane. I currently work as an economist at the Competition Commission. And I've been doing that work for 3 years, coming on to 3 years in October. My journey to public service, I think, it started actually when I was studying. So I've spent a lot of time interested in issues of employment, of growth as an economist. That was always what interested me and what excited me. And when I started working in private practice as a consultant, I found myself working on a lot of projects that were sort of on the periphery of public service in a way. So interacting a lot with various government programs, departments, etc. Until I got to a point where there was a particular kind of consulting that I didn't enjoy doing. And I headed over to competition and regulatory economics, which opened a whole new world for me. And long story short, I left the world of consulting and hopped over to the other side to being a regulator. And I think that's probably a natural progression given my family background. I have excellent examples of public service in my family. Spent a lot of holidays in government buildings in Pretoria. One would think that would be off-putting, but it actually wasn't. And life on the other side has been daunting. It has been interesting, and I really calcified my view of the public sector as a place where you can have good impacts, do good work, and a place where, and I hope we unpack this as the evening goes on, but a place that really does have space for young, energetic people.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Kagiso. So back to you, Ruth. You mentioned that you had to transition from academia into the public service or from the NGO space. So what are the misconceptions that you had to deal with when you had that transition? Because I think for a lot of people who do make that transition, it's difficult, or those who have never been in public service have those misconceptions and are quick to constantly critique government or those in the public service space. So what are the misconceptions that you had to deal with? And what are the considerations that you feel that those who don't even have that opportunity to be in public service need to think through as well?
Thanks, Lesego. Yeah, I think I definitely had a simplified view of government. Even now, having been in it for a number of years, I feel like I am still building like a mental map of how everything fits together. But I think I had a simplified view in that I thought that all government needed to really work was some really enthusiastic people who wanted to make change, who were competent and committed. And when I got there, I realized that there were a lot of those people already in the space. And I think there's a lot of like misconceptions that we don't have a capable government and we don't have capable people in the space. And so I found it so refreshing to have that challenge, really, to have amazing people that I could learn from and to grapple with some amazing minds, basically, on how to tackle some of these problems. I think it doesn't mean that there isn't a bit of dead weight. I often describe government as like a big corporate, so it's like it's a big machine and there's some really great people and there's also some dead weight. So it's definitely not perfect, but I think it was such an inspiring place to start in. And so I think there were enough good people and enough sense of momentum and purpose to kind of outweigh that. So I think my perception was that, we just need to like get some good people in there and we can shake it up and solve all these problems. And the problems are really hard, and it's much easier to critique than it is to offer alternatives, and let alone develop them and try and make them work in kind of very messy realities. So yeah, I often describe it as an impossible landscape, government, but I don't think that's necessarily inherent to government. I think it's just the issues that we face. So trying to think through some of the challenges that we face around unemployment and inequality and services, especially at a municipal level, trying to figure out how to do that. They're hard, and they're hard everywhere. So I think that was some of my perceptions.
Thanks, Ruth. And then Bheki, for you as well, transitioning from the private sector, moving into government, as Ruth has already mentioned, there is this perception of, the difficulties or the lack of competency within government. Has that been your experience so far? And what have you had to navigate, especially coming from a completely different environment?
Yeah, I think on the point of competence, I think that was something that was almost immediately proved incorrect for me. You know, that people in government, you know, who go there are just have a matric certificate, or do not have qualifications for the job that they actually do, type of a thing. That has almost totally been proven the other way. I mean, some of the people that work in the technical teams that work on Transnet is a good example. You know, there's people there with master's qualifications, not just random masters, but like masters specific to what they're doing, with experience from working at regulators, etc., you know, who are working as part of the problem-solving team. So I think that's definitely one that's been almost immediately shot out the water. The idea that people that side are, you know, not qualified and not skilled enough. You know, maybe something that is still there is the energy factor that I think Ruth that has spoken about. I think I didn't go in there necessarily with a, you know, conception that people are lazy per se, but I just kind of was interested in finding out, you know, why, you know, maybe things weren't working. And I think some of the answers, you know, are down to the system. The size of government in itself is it's actually incredibly difficult to fathom. If anyone, you know, who's on the call works for a very big organization, whatever size you think it is, 100 by 10. And then in addition to that, you add the fact that regulation is required for things to work cleanly and to give confidence to the public. Especially in a democratic system that I think almost all Southern African countries are under. So it's almost kind of like which side do you want? You know, you need the regulation because democracy, and we need the transparency, but that in itself brings about the inefficiencies that we tend to see. So some of those things I've almost found reasons, I think, for some of the inefficiencies that I complained about on the outside. And transitioning in, I think it's been a bit difficult because I think if I found people who've been there for a very long time, I can understand why it can be difficult, you know, to keep that energy up when a system and newspapers and the people out there, and me, who was on the outside, keep saying, you know, you're stupid, you're wrong, you don't know what you're doing. But once you understand the system, you know, you can understand why people can get a bit down. But people do try their best, you know, to kind of keep the energy up there. And I think it just needs more of us. And I say us as in young people, whatever you consider yourself young, up or above 35, but with new ideas, just to come in there and say, within the confines of this crazy regulation, how can we maneuver to get things done and do things a little bit better?
Thanks, Bheki. I think what I'm hearing from both you and Ruth is complex problems require complex solutions. And so I think we come in with a sort of a naivete of how simple maybe things are. But once you're within the system, you see the complexities and that these problems cannot be solved with a simple wand. And therefore, constantly, public servants are grappling with those challenges themselves within their purview. So appreciate that. For you, Kagiso, I want to link this with this question that I've already asked Ruth and Bheki, but I also want to bring it up with Guguletu, who sent us a question in advance that links to the conversation we're having. And her comment is basically, I'm going to be reading it out to all of you, is if public service is aging, however, young people aren't keen to join the system. If they do, they get frustrated and leave, mostly because people refuse to do things differently. So this stagnates the entire service. What do you think needs to happen to get us to listen, adopt, or give new ways a chance, especially because you mentioned you came from a consulting background, and that means that you kind of have to innovate. You want to come in and bring in solutions, but maybe that hasn't been your experience so far. So in response to the comment, what would you say your experience is so far, and how do we change and adopt within these systems to bring in that energy that Bheki referred to?
I think I've been rather fortunate in the institution that I joined. And perhaps it's just the person whom I work for whom I work, our chief economist, James Hodge. I got a lot of autonomy early on. And I think that's a very important thing to be able to give people. Just that ability to say what they're interested in working on, see where that fits into the greater scheme of the organization, and then run with it. The unfortunate thing about public sector planning is that it's incredibly rigid. It happens way in advance. It's agreed before the year, and then you sort of deliver on those targets until you have to set them for the next year. And that's an important thing to do, obviously, because it enforces discipline into the system. It's something for the public to hold us as public servants accountable for. You said you were going to deliver on this. Have you delivered on it? What is the quality of what you've delivered? But at the same time, I do think there must be some flexibility in the system to allow people to respond to things as and when they see them come up. Where I work, in COVID, this was an excellent example where I hadn't joined the commission at the time, but from the outside, you saw the entire institution almost change course, and the entire machinery was focused on how it can contribute to the COVID-19 fight that the government was leading. And then post that, that seems to have fallen away, and it's gone back to the sort of old ways of doing things, sticking to the plan, sticking to the performance plan, etc. So I think a culture where people are able to express what they want to do, given the room to do it, and to see what comes of that. The public sector, can be a very interesting place to work, but only if you are allowed to raise your hand and say, this is what I'm interested in. This is how I think it should be done. Can I have the resources, or can I have the time to explore an idea, bring it back to you and see how it works? I mean, those are the sort of innovations that I think keep people engaged in their work. It's the sort of things that make people excited to wake up and go to work. And if we can figure out a way, and if the leaders in the public sector can figure out a way to have more flexibility around where we put our energies and where we put our time, I think that can go a long way towards keeping young people engaged, and then perhaps getting more young people into the system. I also think there needs to be some innovation about how you get young people into the system. Right now, there isn't a very clear pathway. You sort of look at the newspapers, look at the bulletin, see if something works for you, you apply, you get it, you don't. But perhaps thinking a bit deeper about a sort of young professionals program in the way that the World Bank and United Nations do it, and say, for people with 3 to 5 years experience, we're going to open up a few positions. You're going to be in the public sector, see where you fit in, and if you want to stay, stay. So I think there is a radical rethink that's needed, both in how the state works and how delivery is thought about, but also in how recruitment is done and how you get young people in. Because I think the current system does lend itself towards people staying, and it also lends itself towards people coming in a bit later in their careers. And not to say that more mature people don't have anything to add, but there is a bit of a perverse incentive that I think a lot of us have seen play out in different institutions, where people are coming in because, this is their last thing between retirements. They've tried everything else. Now they want an easy job. So something that, a system that brings people in because they want to make a contribution and not for any other reasons of complacency or comfort that they think the public sector might offer.
Thank you for that insight. I'm looking at Mazuba's comment and Fikile, and I think over to you, Bheki. There is this issue that you spoke about, that there are competencies, there is this excellence that exists, but there probably are limitations that we're not aware of. But I do want you to take it on two ways. One, what are the sort of excellencies and competencies you have seen in the public service that are not obvious to us who are not within the system? But what do you think limits us as the public from being able to see that there are competent people, there are people working towards bringing in this change or bringing this level of good governance within the public service?
So technical competence. So people who are actual specialists, like for example, Kagiso, he is an economist who's a specialist in that specific thing. You find people that work within any regulator, NERSA as an example, the transport regulator. So you find proper dedicated technical people that know what they're doing and that know how to design policy. And how to do the research behind that, the economists behind that. I think I've met quite a number of people who are definitely specialists there. I think what tends to then happen, and this is actually very similar to what you see in private entities, is that the further up you go in any management structure, any leadership structure, the actual technical expertise kind of diminishes, and then it's kind of the person who's either got more leadership skills or was able to work their way up the ladder, not necessarily in a bad way always, but the person who was able to actually make their way up to leadership. And some of the difficulties, linking back to what Kagiso mentioned, is if you get leaders who then maybe don't understand, or maybe lack some of that EQ on how to just manage people as opposed to managing the function itself, then sometimes you can get someone who is working at the Competition Commission, working at I don't know, basic education, etc., who, is focused on the problem itself, not necessarily the people. Whereas, it's possible that you've got the technical people in your team who can focus on the problem and fix it. But so that all they need is someone who can manage the space and allow them the room to do what they have to do, without the political influence from the top, and have that professionalized bureaucracy that we keep on hearing about in the news. I think some of the other ways that maybe the public doesn't. Oh, sorry. I think the question was, why does the public not necessarily see these things? I think within that answer comes right there is, you're not going to hear Kagiso sitting or Ruth sitting or myself sitting in front of a media briefing because that's not the way it works. Same way with a corporate. You're not going to necessarily see an analyst, being the one at the forefront. You'll typically see the team leader or the CEO or the COO being the ones presenting out there. And so these functions are not always advertised or speaking out there. But also, government is complex to understand just in itself. And so therefore, to get the public to understand how prices for electricity are set, out there, it seems very crude. It seems very, almost insensitive, to the pains of people in countries, in the country. But because there's a technical working around it, and it's a bit difficult to bring out an economist to come out and explain that technicality of it. So I don't think I have a clear answer as to how we can try and help the public come through there. Maybe it does come back to comms, communications, and how the different government departments communicate and how often they communicate, to try and simplify concepts, but to still give news out. I mean, if you think about COVID and how we kind of got used to our family meetings, but that was because of a situation of distress. But if we had something like that on a continuous basis in different formats, it might bring about confidence that the public has in whichever different department chooses to use that platform.
Thank you for that. I think don't mention electricity. It's a sensitive one for all of us. Do not even bring that up. But over to you, Ruth. Bheki mentioned something about, the political influences that come in. So just to take a little bit of a turn here, has that impacted the way that you do your work, or has it influence the way that you're able to execute on policy and bring about that change? Just as we're seeing the chat sort of, bemoaning the challenges and the lack of the dead weight that you also refer to, would you say that is a big factor as well in how you deliver on the services that the public expects you to deliver on? Or what is your personal assessment of that?
Yeah, thanks for that question. I think, so my previous role, I worked in the department of the Premier, which most people perceived me to have a direct line to call the Premier and to ask him personally for something. And so, I think whereas in fact, I was in a completely, in an administration side role. And so I think the perception that there's a lot of you navigating the political and the administrative is true, that you are doing that, but there is a division as well. And I think that there's accountability on both sides. And I think we both trying to push, that everyone has their own direction or agenda. And so I think that in a functional system, you can work to kind of shape decision makers views, and most of the time try to make sure that is done with evidence. I think that's been a real challenge in general, is trying to make sure that decisions are made based on some kind of evidence. So I think that because sometimes you do get the sense that people make decisions based on what they see in the news headline or Twitter, and when you're making decisions that have such big impact for so many people, you want to make that those are founded on something. And so I think I've had a generally really positive experience where I felt that there's a clear chain of command within the administrative side, and that there's clear mechanisms to protect that from overly being influenced by politicians, but that we can work together to kind of achieve our goal. I think the part that I find so hard generally about working in this space is the urgency of the challenge and the pace at which you can respond to it. And I think trying to, things like I had a situation where we were working on a malnutrition intervention, and we worked really hard to build this case for this, and it just didn't get the uptake that we were hoping for. And so that felt like in our inability to act, another generation of kids, it's like, it's just the severity of action or inaction is the burden is heavy. And so I think in a healthy and functional space, you can align the political agendas and political direction with administration side. And I think it is helpful to have a really competent technical side, as both my fellow panelists mentioned, is that then you can rely on the kind of evidence that's generated and use that in a strategic way. So yeah, I think there is a role for politics to play a positive role, but it is just challenging to try and find the right timing, particularly like within political terms. So yeah, thanks.
Thanks, Ruth. So it sounds more to me like it's a timing issue. It's an issue versus just it being political. Kagiso, has that been your experience as well? Do you feel like, since you've had a positive experience as well, where you describe your working environment in a positive way, do you feel like politics impacts your day-to-day work, or will it eventually impact your long-term service delivery goals?
I think that's a great question. Our environment is highly and weirdly politicized. I think we had the misfortune of having, and the caveat about personal capacity is very important now, about having a minister in the DTIC system, the previous minister, who wasn't particularly popular with business, and big business in particular. And of course, our job is to regulate big business. So a lot of our work became interpreted through an unfairly political lens. To the extent that, something that I did, I feel was a victim of this, where a newspaper editor and a newspaper, quite frankly, went on a week-long campaign painting what I would admit was a error in communication on our part in how we communicated the findings of a particular report as being the product of an overly politicized environment. So that has been a personal challenge. I think I wasn't expecting that I was stepping into a place where so much of what we do is viewed through that lens. And where even when we make bona fide mistakes, because we are going to make mistakes, it is taken to be as part of some other nefarious agenda. But at the same time, our job as public servants is to give effect to the political program of the day, right? We have, for example, an act. That act is passed by politicians. And ultimately, it is them who are setting some parameters for what we do. In Bheki's case, at Department of Public Enterprises, there's an entire program about the future of state-owned enterprises. That is not a bureaucratic thing that came from the top, right? It came from the politicians. And you can't avoid that. I think the importance is definitely what Ruth was mentioning, is that our role is to bring a regulatory rigor and an analytical, empirical rigor to those decisions and to the programs that politicians bring to us. And sometimes that is a difficult thing to do. You must highlight trade-offs when it's uncomfortable to do so. A lot of our work, I think, involves saying to somebody, look, you want to pursue this course of action, but this is what you lose, or this is what you're trading off by pursuing a particular course of action. And for people, I think at our level, it's important to have leaders who protect you from that mess. It is, quite frankly, it feels like a mess at times. And I think personally, I've been quite fortunate. Again, it goes back to where I work, in that the leaders do a good job of protecting us from those political demands and eventually translating to us, the technical bureaucrats, something that we can work with and really apply our skills to in a way that does not render us now actors in the political theater.
Thanks for that. I just want to follow up based on your response and a question that was also sent in earlier. Do you think a decentralized form of governance would be a good response to sort of this bureaucracy that we're seeing? Or is there a model that basically we can employ to kind of address or mitigate some of the challenges and even the risks? Because while the technical or analytical aspect and rigor needs to exist, at the end of the day, there still needs to be some kind of model that allows those decisions to be made in a way that at that time they are responsive and timely to the issues at hand.
Yeah, it's an interesting question because like the rules of the system matter. Rules matter. I'm big on rules. We've seen the past 10, 15 years what happens when you play fast and loose with the rules. And I do think then there's also been an overcorrection. Like now the rules are a bit too rigid. It goes back to my initial comment. So that balance is very necessary to strike. And I don't quite know if decentralization is the way to do it. I think we are fairly decentralized. I mean, all our spheres, all our departments have reasonable amounts of autonomy in terms of setting their program and responding. I don't know if it's a centralization issue per se, but that might be something worth exploring. And I'm keen to hear, what Ruth thinks as somebody at local government. Actually, is it different at local government? Do you think you work better than us at national?
Before you respond, Ruth, I'm going to open up for questions in about 2 minutes, or rather after Ruth responds. So feel free to prepare that and raise your hands. But I'm also seeing that there's a very interesting comments as well in the chat. So everybody, please feel free to also read those and we'll try to incorporate them within the responses. Ruth, you can go ahead.
Thanks so much. Yeah, it is interesting being in local government. I think definitely feels like the coalface of service delivery in many areas. I think my political leaders are definitely in favor of decentralization, but that I think is often linked to political views and shaped by political parties' positions on issues. So I think, at the moment, there's a lot of discussion about devolution of powers on particular functions. And I think we are learning a lot, like, we all herald our amazing constitution, and I think we should, but it's also, we've had to put it in practice for the last 30 years and we've figured out some things. So it's an interesting tension to think about whether some functions should shift from different spheres of government. I definitely think that the kind of argument for decentralization is largely that if you are responsible for what is in front of you, it is easier for the public to hold you accountable. And it is also easier for you not to pass the buck, basically not to blame someone else or hide in the shadows. So I think that is obviously an argument, but it's also been very interesting to see how at a national level, various problem child departments have been put into the presidency as a centralization move. And that's also been really effective. So I don't think that I don't think you can make a blanket statement about these kind of things, but I think depending on the competencies, for example, there's been a lot of discussion about devolving rail to different levels of government. And that's a huge competency to take on and a huge liability as well. And so while the politicians might be keen for devolution, the administration also has to have the skill to pick it up. And so I think it's got to actually be on a case-by-case basis where you think through whether this competency can actually be carried out and test whether it will work at a different level of government. I think that's also one of the things, maybe to comment on some of the things in the chat around rigidity and rules, is that because there's such a sense of wanting to watch your back and make sure that you're not doing the wrong thing, and because you're very aware of the rules, you compromise things, like you compromise ability to be flexible and to innovate and to test things and to admit when we get things wrong. And so I think we sometimes, it can be quite a punitive environment in that way. And I think what Kagiso was saying about overcorrecting comes from a place of wanting to make sure that we are, being held to a high standard and not falling into, going down hard of list. So in some ways, there are trade.
All right, thank you, Ruth. I think there's a bit of a network issue on your side, if I'm not mistaken. I don't know if I'm the only one getting that, but hopefully that should get better as we respond. As I said, we are now opening up for questions, comments that you might have, so feel free to raise your hand. But Bheki, your mind is probably tingling a little bit after you've just seen some of the thoughts that everybody was sharing. I could see it in your eyes. You had a tinkle that you might want to respond. But as you respond to maybe some of the comments that have been made, I would also want you to think about just times of transition as a public servant. Has it affected you in any way? As we're thinking about the GNU, for example, for some of us who are not from South Africa, it feels like the holy grail, an opportunity for change. So is that the reality? Has it impacted you in a positive way? And what does it mean for you as you think about political transitions, larger overarching political transitions as a public servant?
It's funny you say that. So it's affected me in a bad and a good way. Bad way in the sense that the actual department that I'm in no longer exists, is gone. But it's in a good way because the reform that is going to replace the department being the state asset holding company. I don't think that's the official name, but state asset holding company that will hold the SOE. That reform in itself is great. It's great, and it's something that I buy into based on the actual functions of it, but also based on international precedents, based on kind of countries like Singapore, China, I think it's Slovenia is one of them maybe, but there's quite a few countries that have that corporate holding for kind of companies that are state-owned. So it's been good and bad for me, but in general, for any bureaucracy, I think the coalition GNU, whatever you want to call it, but the idea of having now not just one political party being at the head, I think I think can be good. I say can because it depends on implementation of the departments, but it can be good because there's likely to be competition amongst them as the politicians, and it's competition to be more effective. But also that means that there's people who are coming into places where maybe they've never governed before, or they don't know how the system works, which means that you had to rely on the people who've been there for a while, which then means that one of our big jobs, as bureaucrats, is to recommend to our principals. So if they're doing their jobs properly, then they should be leaning even more on the people who've been doing these functions for a while to recommend further. This is not to say we're taking over their positions or fully influencing and taking everything, but it's to recommend for them to consider alongside their advisors and other technical views, etc. So I would hope that it does do that, because then all the knowledge that's been within all these departments for a while and municipalities, etc., that can come through, and hopefully influence in a good way that good things can come about. Now, on the idea of reform, not just linked to coalition or GNU, but I think Ruth mentioned the idea of rail, and I can speak on that because it's something I work quite a bit on. But whether it's South Africa, Namibia, Zimbabwe, Zambia, Mozambique, all of these Southern African countries have been going through some kind of massive rail reform over the number of years. I think Mozambique has probably gotten it close to kind of a bit better in terms of bringing the private sector in there. But, there's kind of almost a shift in acknowledgement that, listen, there's something that we can do, something that we can't do. And the things that we can't do, maybe we can bring in the private sector to take on some elements of it. But, while that, for some of us, number crunches may be like a commercial decision. Numbers wise, you don't have the capacity, you don't have the money. It's actually a very political decision, because as soon as you mention the word privatization, everyone just starts to hate you. And, some of it is privatization, some of it is not necessarily that word. But the idea of political reform and kind of how it goes about, I think it's necessary. I think politicians are realizing that they don't have a choice in a lot of it for the sake of their own survival as leaders. If they want to keep and hold on to power, they need to move with the times. Unfortunately, it's not fast, it's slow, and that's just kind of the pace of government as it is.
Thank you for that, Bheki. Before I respond, I was just going to say I'm seeing more comments about this back and forth about decentralization in the chat, and I just wanted to say I think that is it's a complex issue. It works in certain instances, as Ruth had already mentioned, and might not work in certain instances. It might be something we need to take away as a working group to maybe bring as a separate conversation that we unpack further. So I really do appreciate some of the comments I'm seeing. Same question to you, Kagiso, but I also want to add a question that Shoni's asking in the chat, which is, can you tell us an example where you saw innovation? Has the transition meant more innovation or less for you? And any change that you've experienced or saw happening, and has it shown any success?
I think one of the things I'm seeing in the new dispensation, and it's quite positive, is a whole lot more collaboration seems to really be starting to take hold, and collaboration across the various parts of the public sector. We as a regulator perhaps need to be a bit more careful in terms of where we intervene, etc. But we're seeing people coming to us asking for advice, asking for competition type advice, asking for us to lend our capabilities to the challenges that they might have with what are, quite frankly, cross-governmental priorities of economic inclusion, transformation, etc. And perhaps the seeds were laid in the previous administration, but in the past 2 months that has really sort of picked up. And it's going to be quite exciting to see what might come out of that way of working. And I think it's a start in the direction that I alluded to earlier on, because, suddenly I'm not only a competition economist, but I can dabble a little bit in agriculture in one of the projects I'm working on with the Department of Agriculture. Eventually, I might dabble in other things with, so for example, the DTIC and people there on the sector desks. So things like that, I think are going to be par for the course going forward, especially because within this GNU situation, I think now the issue of how we use our resources is going to be quite important. We won't be able to get away with saying that we're going to be more prudent and then not being more prudent. We're actually going to have to do it because of that political contestation within cabinets that Bheki alluded to. So that does present interesting opportunities going forward. On the innovation question, one of the places where I really did see interesting innovation, but it's innovation that failed. And I think part of the government's problem is not being able to acknowledge when things fail. And where I first saw that I was in consulting, and I worked on the evaluation of the NHI pilot programs. There's those scary 3 letters. And our evaluation report wasn't nice. It wasn't complimentary to that system at all. And it essentially said, look, you don't have much here. What you set out to achieve, you didn't achieve. Go back to the drawing board. And that's okay to hear at the end of a pilot, because that's the purpose of the pilot, right? It's to figure out what's working, to figure out what's not working, and go back to the drawing board and see what you take forward and what you don't take forward. As far as I can see, nothing happened to those findings, and the act is the act. And now there seems to be what I think is a very bad thing happening, which is trying to tinker with the act after it's been passed. And there's probably a discussion for another day. I think we should caution against those tendencies. But a lot could have been avoided if really, when you do these pilots and you're testing things, you actually take the results of the tests and reflect on them and then change things. So I hope that is something that is also going to come in with in the future, is really taking seriously experimentation and allowing yourself to fail, and then moving forward from that failure, rather than trying to then force a success when you have to do a radical rethink.
Thanks for that, Kagiso. Similar question, Ruth, but also adding on top of it, any predictions? This is a question from Shani. Any predictions on the next big change we can expect to see, especially as we're considering transition? And also, I'm seeing some hate towards benchmarking and workshops. I want Ruth, Bheki, and Kagiso to go on these things, guys. Let's not deny them. Maybe that's what will motivate some of us to go into public service. So those are the little incentives. I don't know why there's hate for per diem in the chat that I'm seeing right now. But anyway, Ruth, your thoughts.
I clearly am not doing government right because I've never got a per diem, guys. I don't know, maybe my national colleagues know what this is about, but yeah, I think just on the innovation question, just before I respond to Lesego's question, I think innovation, particularly in the public sector, is not really about technology. I heard something once that said, if you hear that's not how we do things here, then you're going in the right direction. So often it's, especially when you're trying to kind of bring in evidence or kind of trying to change up accepted views about things, I think that's what we mean when we talk about innovation in the public sector, is trying to think about new ways of doing things. And sometimes that means doing pilots and trialing things and being open to experimentation. But yeah, I think just one example that was really exciting for me was when I worked in the province, I worked on a violence prevention program that we developed with a research group over 3 years, and scaled up a pilot to be a successful program that, according to the evaluation, Kagiso did have some positive impact, not only bad things. But yeah, but that was a huge undertaking. That's not the barrier to entry for new programs is a lot higher than some of the existing programs that we have in the space that we just accept. So that's just the one thing. And then just to say on the predictions, I don't know, I feel like every day doesn't fail to surprise me what's happening, but I will say that I think the coalition at national, I've been really positive and really excited by. I think my fellow panelists also mentioned that there's been a sort of spirit of collaboration, and definitely at a local government level, and especially a opposition-run municipality, it's been interesting to see that shift of having an opposition identity shift into being a collaboration and opposition identity. Some people are still figuring out the line on which side they want to be on, but I think particularly around our kind of advocacy agenda, so things that are within our control and are part of municipal competencies, but then also thinking about strategies to influence things that are beyond our control, and that has changed. And so I think I really hope that the national coalition continues to stay in place and strengthen. I think the fallout at a local government level with coalition governments has been very difficult. A lot of the sense of progress and direction that I've experienced as a public servant has been because I've been in a majority party government, and that's meant that there's stability. And although there's, division within a party and whatever, there's at least a coherent sense of where you're going. And so, yeah, my predictions are that it's going to get a bit messy, and I really hope that we get through that with a sense of where we're going with it. that it doesn't become, doesn't get dissolve into petty politics. But yeah, that's me. Thanks.
Thanks, Ruth. Same question to you, Kagiso, but I do want to give our fellow people on the call an opportunity to say something. So feel free to raise your hand, and when I point out to you, you'll be able to unmute your mic and share your thoughts. So just instead of just having your comments on the chat, I would like to at least one or two of you, as we're inching closer and closer towards the end of this conversation. So feel free to do that. But Kagiso, over to you. Similar question. What are your thoughts?
My thoughts on the future. Yeah, apparently if you look through a crystal ball, you might find yourself eating glass. So I will, I'll try to be as cautious as possible. I think we are in for a generally positive time. I have been surprised, I think, by just how quickly everybody has gotten used to this new system. I mean, it is a new system. I mean, we had a conference recently, and we had 2 deputy ministers, which is almost unheard of, to like host something and then you have such high levels of interest from your political principles. But I do think it comes with the realization from everyone that the election result is really a call to work. So I think it's going to be there's going to be a lot happening. I think all 3 of us perhaps know or privy to some things that are happening that we might not be able to share right now. But there is a lot happening, and there is a new urgency. And hopefully there is then a maturity to not have things devolve into a messy spectacle if some of these urgent programs don't work as well as they should. And there is a sort of presence of mind to play the long game, because the worst thing that could happen, and there is a risk, is that we end up in a place where we are no longer playing the long game, but going for quick short-term wins, simply because the parties are only focused on the next election and gaining an extra few seats in parliament and hoping that that is more dominant in cabinet. I think if everybody remains committed to playing the long game, good things are going to happen.
Same question to you, Bheki. The future, what are your thoughts? Where do the opportunities exist, do you think, for the future? I'm hoping the reason why I'm not seeing any raised hands is because our panelists are so fantastic. You just want to keep hearing them share their thoughts at this point in time. But as I said, we're really grateful for the kind of engagement we're seeing in the chat. But yeah, over to you, Bheki.
Yeah, I'm gonna try and answer the future question also by linking some of the questions or themes I've seen in the chat. And I mean, I think there was a comment about what sort of pushback, have you gotten to change, and what our thoughts about public-private partnerships. And I think those in link from what I've seen, at least from what I've worked in the future, is that I think I understand why some people wait until they're older to come into public service. I don't think it's necessarily right, but there is a level of, there's a bit more patience that I think you need to have, or a bit more maturity that you need to have when you come into a room. This technically works in any organization you come into. If you come into any place and you say to people, you've been doing this wrong, change your ways, you're immediately going to get resistance. This is in any way. I think it's just human nature to kind of get defensive in that manner. And I think it's something that we get wrong as younger type people, with coming with the right intentions and maybe a little bit too much energy. And the first things out of our mind is, why have you been doing this the wrong way? It's inefficient. And I think that's maybe a lesson I can say to everyone. And I think a lot of people have had that experience, that there's sometimes a little bit of patience and wisdom in understanding how to bring about these different ideas, how to lobby. And not necessarily lobby in a bad sense, but how to build and understand the different power dynamics and who to kind of speak to where, in the workshop or outside the workshop. And those dynamics, I think, work in any kind of environment, I think, and the higher up you go in any structure, it gets even more. So that a kind of pushback you'll get, it's very similar in that, just don't put people on the back foot. and then they won't get there, trying to understand their side and then slowly but surely massage things in. Someone may say we don't have the time in government, but, well, I think you'd rather try and do things the right way than do them in the wrong way. Linked very closely to that for me is the idea of public-private partnerships. And what I see into the future, I think, SARS is amazing. SARS collects quite a bit of money in this country, and I believe quite a few countries in Southern Africa are not horrible from a financial standpoint. Maybe bar Zimbabwe. I'm not saying it's we've got all the money in the world, but fairly well run. But there is a limitation in the amount of resources versus the programs that need to be put out. Infrastructure being one of the very big ones across the whole of Southern Africa. So I think the one thing that I do see more of is public-private partnerships coming into place. But I think the one caveat that I do want to put out there is in as much as government maybe has a limitation in resources, I think there is a very big responsibility on the private sector to not abuse that. That in coming to the negotiation table and saying, listen, we can see that you own the infrastructure, or you actually own the assets. We want to do the operations on top because we're better at this. Coming to that negotiation table, just almost in good faith and negotiating in a positive way and understanding that, look, the returns are going to be different from a financial perspective because this is the public good. I'm going to use rail as an example, as Ruth had mentioned about, maybe bringing that to municipalities. Water is a massive issue now. We're going to see a lot of that coming up. So in as much as there's responsibility for government to come out and say, private sector, we want to work with you, also responsibility on private sector to not try and abuse the system, to not try and say, oh, you're desperate, I'm therefore going to make as much money as possible. And therefore just like to not then ask for too much because the position is so dire. I think the more, if more of us understand that there are some things that a government is to do for the good of the people, there are some things that cannot be privatized. Because if they do, it'll just lead to all hell breaking loose. People say it'll get efficient, but that efficiency will be great for a very short period of time. The pain will last much longer. And then, sorry, just the last point, just on the idea of, attending workshops and all that type of stuff. I think that because the problems are so complex at government levels, the idea of the extra trainings, workshops there, and I'm also using that word workshops to look at public consultations. The trainings are important to upskill, just like anywhere else. And the workshops are important because if you don't get the feedback from the people, then the same people are going to be the one to come back and saying, I've got no idea what you're talking about. How are you going to say you're implementing this thing in my community when I've never heard about this? And it's a difficult one to balance because you want to get everyone's views, but you also want to do things fast. And if you do things fast, then you make mistakes. Even if you acknowledge you're wrong, people are going to be the same people who come first and say, you see this government. They don't know what they're doing with this mayor or this premier or et cetera, et cetera. So it's not an easy one. There does need to be a balance to it. I can acknowledge that. But yeah, so there's a little bit of maybe a bit more understanding on that.
Thanks, Bheki. We're coming towards the close, but I don't want to leave out the hand that I'm seeing raised. So I'm going to give you, Dineo, an opportunity to share your thoughts. Keep it very brief. And then after that, we will be wrapping up. Dineo?
Okay, thank you, Lesego. Brilliant conversation, everybody. Thank you so much for this conversation. I think my question is around, I don't think the solution should happen, particularly in rail. I don't think we should give Cape Town a metro rail, no. But that's a side comment. But I think for me, the question is around like Project U, right? Going back to Project U, I want to know that now that you guys have transitioned, or some of you have always worked in the public sector, like where to now? Like how do you stay in public sector, and considering all the challenges that you guys have mentioned, and how would you encourage somebody who wants to join public sector or who has joined public sector and left again to like stay the course? Thank you.
I think Kagiso, you can start.
I don't know what the future holds. I am reasonably happy in the public service, so I don't see myself leaving imminently. To somebody who wants to join, I say, look, give it a shot. It can be really good and fulfilling work, but also know what you're getting yourself into, right? So if you are a lawyer coming from Alice Lane, know that for all the fulfillment that you're going to get, there's no equity to be had in the government, and there are no bonuses to be paid out at the end of the financial year. But if those sort of things, you're ready to let go of those sort of things, or you're ready to take a break from those sort of things and maybe return to them later, do your best to enter the system. There are a lot of people who are on the other side, ready to welcome you and ready to work with you. I have been surprised by just how many people across the public sector are willing to work with others and to share their knowledge. It's not something that I thought happened when I was on the other side. I thought I was joining the regulator to be a regulator, but my work has been so much more than that. And precisely because of this attitude, which I think is picking up recently of cross collaboration across departments and across functions. So do give it a shot if you want to come in. But yeah, think about where you want to go and your long-term ambitions, because it's very easy also to end up in a place where you aren't happy and you aren't fulfilled. As Bheki said, this thing is a huge machine. We only represent 3 parts of it, and 3 parts of it that are quite tiny when you think about the whole thing. And one thing that I think the government does not do a good job of is creating sort of contact points for people who want to come in. So you're lucky you're on this call, you know us, but also try find the people in your network who can help you get a better sense of the system, and where somebody who wants to do what you want to do with your skills and capabilities can fit in and make an impact. And if you find that sweet spot, I promise you won't regret it.
Great, thank you, Kagiso. Ruth, over to you. And then Bheki, keep your comments brief because we will be closing up soon.
Thanks, Lesego, and thanks, Tanea, for the great question. I think particularly in government, there is a sense that once you're there for life, and it is quite striking to that. Yeah, that you meet people who have been in government for 40 years, and that's not that common in other fields. So I think there is that kind of staying power that perhaps comes partly from sheltered employment, but also I think when people do find that sweet spot that you're talking about, Kagiso, then it can be very meaningful to give your life to something, that it's a lifetime commitment. I don't know if it is for me forever. I think the prospect of committing to anything for that long it does seem quite daunting. But I think what I have found encouraging is that there's quite a clear sense of progression, and that there are mentors and people that you can learn from. So I think often when I've been in different spheres as well, just looking around and trying to see, okay, who do I look up to in this space? Who do I want to be in 2 years, 5 years, etc. And sometimes it takes you a little while to find out who that is. Maybe they're not in your immediate space. But I found that very helpful, just to think about that this is where I'd want to move towards, or this is the kind of area that I actually really like, and this is an area that I'd want to spend more time in. So I think that's around the kind of sense of once you're in, where do you go? But for people who are thinking about it, I'd really encourage it. I think it's such a good education in how big systems work and how government works in general. And I think there are pockets of excellence. It's what I found so encouraging about Futurelect, is just tapping into pockets of excellence across the region in all different spheres of government, but also outside. And to find a space that you feel values your contribution, and that you can really leverage your impact in the way that is in line with what your values and what you like for your life. So yeah, I'd really encourage it, and don't feel daunted by coming for 40 years. Just come for a year, see what it's like, and move around, and don't feel stuck. Thanks. Bheki?
So I think the goal one day is to have the mobility between private and public to be seamless, and to be seen as if I'm a agriculture specialist, finance person, or economist, or whatever it is, this side, I can be that this side. But we're not there yet, because there's a lot of conceptions that, once you're there for life, or you can't move, or you don't do any work. So then the private sector doesn't want you back. So in the meantime, before we get to that position, I think in terms of making a person an overall professional, whatever sphere of work you are in, I think you can only gain and you can only gain insight for yourself and be a better value add wherever you may want to end up one day, by saying that, listen, not only do I read these newspapers and speak about this and critique, I've been there. I've actually worked along like on the other side. And in terms of your own career planning, as Ruth mentioned, if you can find your niche and find your space, go there for a short period of time and know what you're going there to get, and understand that, listen, this is part of a journey, of yourself as a professional in whatever else that it may be. It doesn't have to be forever. In the same way that when you take that job at that consulting firm or at that NGO, wherever, that's not forever in yourself. So try and view it in the same way as you do that. But of course, there is a level of public good. I'm doing something good for the country that I live in. Controversial comments, but the idea of everyone having to do it for a 6-month period, a year period, could contribute to some kind of a national good. And I think if we see it as an idea that everyone has done something by working in there, then I think the conversations we have about the solutions outside can also be richer, because then we can also then start saying, I think this can happen because I understand this works this way, or I have a respect that there are some difficulties and things aren't purely about kind of privatization or taking things away from government. But yeah, I hope at least one person is inspired to have a look at a government website or something like that and join this side of the world.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Bheki. I absolutely agree, obviously, with my panelists. I bring shame to them, though, because I transitioned out of government and now I'm in the private space. But I will say that I had not worked within the government space that I did, I wouldn't be able to consult the way that I do with government. So even if you don't have a long-term career in government, even when you step outside, something that Bheki mentioned about the relationship between the private and the public sector, I think I'm better able to address or speak to the issues within the government better if I didn't have that experience. I think that it gives me an insight that I wouldn't have had otherwise, now that I'm on the consulting side of things. So I think it's valuable regardless of the longevity you might want to have in terms of a career in public service. And obviously, as being part of Futurelect and the alumni program, encourage everybody, be it politics, be it government, to be part of some kind of public good. So thank you so much to my panelists. That was a perfect ending and good question from Dineo. If I could just get some, clap hand emojis or reactions from all of you, I appreciate them. Thank you for giving us a little bit of extra time, but we will be ending our conversation here. Hopefully you'll join more of them. You invite others as well to join these conversations. It's been insightful. And I think just from the chat itself, we will definitely take and glean some of the insights and develop more focused conversations around specific issues within governance and what is good governance and what will that look like across different themes. So that ends our conversation for today. Thank you so much, and we'll see you soon. Go ahead and like all the posts, share, and continue to engage in the conversation moving forward. Thank you yet again, and good night, everybody.